I never thought a crumbling farmhouse would nearly land me in jail. But that's what happens when your dream home falls within the invisible boundaries of an HOA you never knew existed. The first time I laid eyes on the Oak Ridge farmhouse, I knew it was meant to be mine despite its sagging roof, rotting porch boards, and windows clouded by decades of neglect. As a structural engineer with a passion for historical restoration, I saw beyond the decay to the sturdy bones beneath. The realtor, however, seemed eager to unload the property, rushing through our tour with suspiciously vague answers about the surrounding area. "And what about the neighborhood regulations?" I asked, noting the newer developments visible beyond the property's 5 acres of overgrown meadow. "Nothing to worry about, Mr. Weston," he assured me, flashing a too bright smile. "The property predates all that. It's grandfathered in." I should have pressed harder, but the price was right, and my enthusiasm clouded my judgment. So at 36, I, Simon Weston, became the proud owner of a dilapidated 100-year-old farmhouse in Meadow Creek, Virginia, just outside of Richmond. The troubles began exactly 3 days after I closed on the property. I was unloading lumber from my truck when a silver BMW pulled into my gravel driveway, kicking up dust that seemed to personally offend the woman who emerged from the vehicle. She wore a crisp white pantsuit and oversized sunglasses that she removed with theatrical slowness, revealing narrowed eyes that assessed my property with visible disdain. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice carrying the false sweetness that immediately set my teeth on edge. "Are you the new owner?" I set down the boards I was carrying and wiped my hands on my jeans. "Yes, madam, Simon Weston. Just moved in this week." "Patricia Greenwood," she announced, not extending her hand. "President of the Meadow Creek Estates Homeowners Association." She emphasized each word as if bestowing a royal title. "I don't believe we've received your renovation plans for approval." I blinked, confusion washing over me. "I'm sorry, what? There must be some mistake. This property isn't part of any development." Patricia's laugh was brittle. "Oh, I assure you it is. This entire area was incorporated into our association 15 years ago. Your realtor should have informed you." He had not. In fact, he had implied the exact opposite. "I was told this property was grandfathered in," I said, feeling the first tendrils of dread creeping up my spine. "Grandfathered exemptions only apply to existing structures in their current state," she explained with the patience one might use with a child. "Any modifications require board approval. And frankly," her gaze swept over the farmhouse with unconcealed revulsion, "this place is an absolute eyesore. We've been hoping the next owner would tear it down and build something more appropriate for our community standards." I followed her gaze to my farmhouse. Yes, it was weathered and worn, but beneath the peeling white paint and missing shutters lay a piece of local history, built by hand in 1921 by one of the area's founding families. "I have no intention of tearing it down," I said firmly. "I'm restoring it to its original condition." Patricia's smile tightened. "Then you'll need to submit detailed plans, color schemes, material specifications, landscaping proposals, and historical documentation proving your restoration is authentic. The board meets monthly, and submissions must be in 2 weeks before the meeting for consideration." She handed me a thick envelope emblazoned with the Meadow Creek Estates logo. "Our covenant guidelines. I suggest you read them thoroughly before proceeding. Any unauthorized work will result in immediate fines of $500 per day." As she turned to leave, she paused, her gaze lingering on the pile of lumber I'd been unloading. "And please store your materials out of sight. Visible construction supplies violate Section 8, Paragraph 12 of our aesthetic guidelines." With that parting shot, Patricia returned to her immaculate BMW and drove away, leaving me standing in a cloud of dust, clutching a rulebook for a game I never agreed to play. That night, I pored over the documents, my stomach sinking with each page. The covenant was a labyrinth of restrictions, from approved paint colors, various shades of beige, gray, and heritage white, to permitted landscaping. No vegetable gardens visible from the street, to fencing regulations, 4 feet maximum height, only certain approved styles. Nothing about the guidelines would allow me to restore the farmhouse to its authentic historical appearance. The next morning, I called my realtor, who conveniently couldn't be reached. His voicemail was full, and emails bounced back. I then contacted a local real estate attorney who confirmed my worst fears. Yes, HOAs could absorb previously unaffiliated properties through various legal mechanisms. And yes, I should have been informed, but proving deliberate non-disclosure would be an uphill battle. "These covenants run with the land," explained Laura Atkinson, the attorney whose office walls were lined with framed newspaper articles about her victories against various local developers. "Even if you weren't properly informed, you're legally bound by them unless you can prove fraud or find some loophole in the HOA's incorporation documents." "So what are my options?" I asked, the taste of defeat bitter in my mouth. Laura leaned forward, her expression sympathetic but pragmatic. "Either comply with the HOA, fight them in court with uncertain odds, or sell the property and cut your losses." None of those options appealed to me. I had sunk my savings into this place, drawn by its history and the challenge of bringing it back to life. The thought of giving up or building some cookie-cutter McMansion made my skin crawl. "There might be one other possibility," Laura said thoughtfully. "Historical designation. If you can get the property listed on the state or national register of historic places, it could override some HOA restrictions." That was the glimmer of hope I needed. I spent the next 2 weeks researching the farmhouse's history, digging through county archives, and connecting with the local historical society. The property had belonged to the Mercer family, one of the area's earliest settlers, and the house had been built by Thomas Mercer, who later became a state senator in the 1930s. Armed with this information and detailed plans for a historically accurate restoration, I submitted my application to the HOA board while simultaneously beginning the process for historical designation. Then, I waited. And while I waited, I couldn't just sit idle watching my new home deteriorate further. The roof had several leaks that would cause substantial damage if left unaddressed before winter. So I began making what I considered emergency repairs, replacing the most damaged sections of roofing with period-appropriate materials. I was on the roof, carefully removing rotted shingles, when the now familiar sound of Patricia's BMW crunching over my gravel driveway reached my ears. I looked down to see not just Patricia but 2 other board members and a man with a camera documenting my unauthorized work. "Mr. Weston," Patricia's voice carried easily in the quiet country air, "you are in direct violation of the covenant. Cease work immediately." I carefully made my way down the ladder. "The roof is leaking. I'm preventing water damage. That's basic maintenance which is allowed under your own guidelines. Section 4, paragraph 3. Patricia's eyes narrowed at having her own regulations quoted back at her. "Replacing roofing materials constitutes renovation, not maintenance. The board has not approved your application." "You haven't rejected it either," I pointed out. "And in the meantime, I'm trying to prevent structural damage." "That's for the board to decide," interjected one of her companions, a balding man with the perpetually aggrieved expression of someone who'd made complaining his hobby. "I'm Martin Fletcher, Vice President of the Board. You were clearly informed no work should proceed without approval." The third board member, a woman with a tight ponytail and yoga clothes that had never seen a drop of sweat, stepped forward. "We're issuing a formal violation notice. Work must stop immediately, and the board will assess fines at our next meeting." I felt my blood pressure rising. This house has stood for a century. It has historical significance. I'm trying to preserve it, not change it. "History is irrelevant," Patricia dismissed with a wave of her hand. "Current community standards are what matter, and frankly, this property has been an eyesore for years." We had hoped the new owner would have the decency to consider the negative impact on neighboring property values. I looked around pointedly at my nearest neighbors, who were at least a quarter-mile away across open fields. Whose property values exactly am I affecting from way out here? Patricia's lips thinned to a nearly invisible line. "Community aesthetics impact everyone. The covenant is clear. All exterior modifications must be approved. Period." They left me with another violation notice, this one carrying a $1,000 fine for unauthorized work. As they drove away, I noticed a gleam of satisfaction in Patricia's eyes that seemed disproportionate to the situation. This wasn't just about rules for her, this was personal somehow. That evening, I received an unexpected visitor. An older gentleman in overalls walked up my driveway, moving with the unhurried gait of someone who'd lived long enough to know that few things are truly urgent. "Evening," he called out as he approached. "Name's Harold Jenkins, live about a mile down the road." I introduced myself, and Harold nodded at the farmhouse. "Saw you working on the old Mercer place. Glad someone's finally fixing it up proper. My daddy used to work these fields back in the day." We chatted about the farm's history, and I mentioned my troubles with the HOA. Harold's weathered face creased with disgust. "That woman's been a thorn in everyone's side since they built that fancy development. Been trying to get her hands on this property for years. Wanted to tear it down and extend their golf course through here." This new information made Patricia's hostility click into place. "She wanted to buy the property," Harold nodded. "Made offers to the previous owner multiple times. Old man Mercer wouldn't sell. After he passed, his kids wanted to, but there was some legal holdup with the will. By the time it cleared, you'd already made your offer." I thought back to the realtor's eagerness to close quickly, his vague answers about the neighborhood. Had he been trying to push the sale through before Patricia could intervene? Or had he deliberately concealed the HOA issue to make the sale? "Harold, do you know when this area was incorporated into the HOA and how that happened?" The old man scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Must have been around 2010. There was some county rezoning and they somehow got this parcel included. Always seemed fishy to me. Old man Mercer fought it, but he was already sick by then." I thanked Harold for the information, which had confirmed my growing suspicion that something wasn't right about the HOA's claim on my property. The next day, I drove to the county records office and requested all documents related to the rezoning and HOA incorporation. The clerk seemed surprised by my interest, but directed me to the digital archives. Hours of searching revealed some interesting discrepancies. The original HOA boundaries clearly excluded the farmhouse property, but a subsequent amendment had expanded them to include several outlying parcels, including mine. However, the documentation showed that affected property owners were supposed to have been notified and given a chance to contest the inclusion, something old man Mercer, according to Harold, had indeed tried to do. I dug deeper and discovered that the amendment had passed by a single vote during a special meeting held at an unusual time, 9 a.m. on a Tuesday, when most working residents couldn't attend. The minutes showed minimal attendance, primarily board members and their spouses. Armed with this information, I returned to Laura Atkinson's office. She reviewed my findings with growing interest. "This could be significant," she said, tapping her pen against the documents. "If proper notification procedures weren't followed, or if there was any manipulation of the voting process, we might have grounds to contest your property's inclusion in the HOA." Hope flickered within me. What do we need to prove that? Records of the notification attempts, testimonies from other affected property owners, evidence of any procedural violations during the amendment process. She leaned back in her chair. "It won't be easy, but it's a much stronger angle than what we had before." While Laura began the legal process of challenging the HOA's jurisdiction, I continued my research into the farmhouse's history for the historical designation application. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that the property deserved preservation. My application to the Virginia Department of Historic Resources was progressing well, but I knew it would take months for official designation. In the meantime, the farmhouse's condition continued to deteriorate, and the HOA fines were accumulating. I decided to take a calculated risk. I would continue essential repairs while fighting the HOA's jurisdiction, documenting everything meticulously to demonstrate both the historical significance of my work and the necessity of the repairs. This strategy led to an escalating war with Patricia and her board. Each day brought new violation notices, increasingly hostile confrontations, and even attempts to block delivery trucks bringing my historically accurate materials. One morning, I arrived at the property to find an official-looking notice tacked to my front door declaring the house unsafe and uninhabitable, and ordering me to vacate immediately. The notice purported to be from the county building inspector, but when I called the county office to verify, they had no record of such an inspection or notice. The fake violation notice was a new low and potentially illegal. I reported it to the sheriff's department, who took my statement but seemed reluctant to get involved in what they viewed as a civil matter. That evening, as I was carefully removing damaged siding to prepare for replacement, a sheriff's deputy pulled up. My heart sank, assuming Patricia had escalated her complaints to law enforcement. Instead, the deputy, a woman named Officer Reynolds, approached with a neutral expression. "Mr. Weston, I'm following up on your report about the fraudulent building violation notice." I showed her the fake notice and explained the situation. To my surprise, she listened attentively, taking notes and asking relevant questions about the HOA dispute. "This isn't the first complaint we've had about this particular HOA," she admitted after I finished. "Nothing that's crossed into criminal territory before, but there's been a pattern of aggressive enforcement. Forgery and impersonating a government official seems pretty criminal to me," I pointed out. Officer Reynolds nodded. "If we can prove who posted the notice, yes, that could lead to charges. Do you have any security cameras?" I didn't, but the idea was appealing. "I'll install some right away." After she left, I ordered a comprehensive security system with cameras covering all approaches to the house. While waiting for delivery, I continued my work and my research. Through the local historical society, I connected with Eliza Mercer, a granddaughter of the original owner who still lived in the area. She was delighted that someone wanted to restore her family's homestead, and provided me with a treasure trove of old photographs showing the farmhouse in its prime, along with family stories and details about original features long since obscured by later modifications. Grandpa Thomas would turn in his grave if he knew what that woman wants to do to his home, Eliza said, shaking her head as she shared a photo album with me at her assisted living apartment. He built every inch of it himself, milled the lumber from trees on the property. The mantelpiece in the living room, hand-carved from a single oak that fell during a storm in 1919. I hadn't even realized the significance of the fireplace mantel, which was now painted over with layers of cheap white paint. Examining Eliza's photos, I could see the intricate carvings depicting local wildlife and farm scenes. You think your grandfather would have any documentation about fighting the HOA incorporation? I asked. Eliza's eyes lit up. He kept everything. After he passed, most of his papers went to my brother James. He's not well these days, early dementia, but I can call his daughter. They might still have Grandpa's files. This connection proved invaluable. James Mercer's daughter, Catherine, not only had her great-grandfather's documents regarding the HOA dispute, but was a paralegal at a law firm in Richmond. She was eager to help fight what she called the ongoing injustice against her family's legacy. The documents revealed that Thomas Mercer had indeed formally contested the inclusion of his property in the HOA and had received written acknowledgement of his objection from the county. However, when the final rezoning was approved, his objection was mysteriously absent from the record. I brought this evidence to Laura, who immediately filed a motion with the county court to temporarily suspend the HOA's authority over my property, pending a full review of the incorporation process. "This is exactly what we needed," she said, excitement evident in her voice. Evidence of procedural irregularities and potentially deliberate omission of a formal objection. The court will have to take this seriously. The day after we filed, Patricia showed up at my door, her face flushed with anger beneath her perfectly highlighted bob. "You're making a serious mistake," she hissed, foregoing any pretense of pleasantry. "The board is prepared to offer you a one-time settlement. We'll waive all accumulated fines if you withdraw your frivolous legal challenge and submit to proper HOA oversight." I leaned against my porch railing, taking in her barely contained fury. "Why is this so important to you, Patricia? This is just one old house on the outskirts of your precious development. Why not simply let it be excluded?" Something flashed in her eyes, calculation, perhaps, or worry. "Community standards must be maintained. Exceptions lead to chaos." "Or is it about the golf course extension?" I asked casually, watching her reaction carefully. "Harold Jenkins mentioned you've been trying to acquire this property for years." Patricia's composure slipped momentarily before she recovered. "That's ancient history. The development plans have evolved." "Have they? Because it seems like an awful lot of effort to bring one peripheral property into compliance unless there's something specific you want from it." She straightened her designer jacket. "The offer stands until our next board meeting. After that, we'll proceed with placing a lien on your property for the accumulated fines. Think carefully about your options, Mr. Weston." As she walked away, I called after her, "You might want to consult with your attorney about fraudulent government notices. I've filed a police report about that little stunt." Patricia froze mid-step, then continued to her car without turning around. The slight stiffening of her shoulders told me all I needed to know. She'd been involved in the fake violation notice. That evening, my newly installed security cameras captured footage of Martin Fletcher, the HOA vice president, surreptitiously placing another notice on my door before quickly driving away. This one claimed to be from the health department, citing unsanitary conditions and rodent infestation. I immediately sent the footage to Officer Reynolds, who arrived the next morning to take an official report. This time, she seemed less hesitant about pursuing the matter. Impersonating government officials is a criminal offense, she confirmed. With video evidence identifying the perpetrator, we can move forward with charges. While the sheriff's department began their investigation, I continued my restoration work with renewed determination. The hearing for our motion to suspend the HOA's authority was scheduled for the following month, but in the meantime, I had a roof to finish and windows to restore. The community began to take notice of the conflict. Several long-time residents, emboldened by my stand against the HOA, shared their own stories of Patricia's overreach and intimidation tactics. One elderly couple had been fined repeatedly for a bird bath in their backyard. Another family had faced harassment for planting native wildflowers instead of the approved ornamental shrubs. Local interest grew further when the Historical Society published a feature about the farmhouse's significance in their quarterly newsletter, complete with Eliza's photos showing the property in its original glory. A reporter from the Richmond Times-Dispatch contacted me about doing a story on historic preservation versus modern development pressures. Patricia must have sensed the shifting public opinion. Her tactics escalated. Anonymous complaints were filed with various county departments: building safety, environmental health, zoning enforcement. Each required inspections that found no actual violations but delayed my work and added to my stress. Then came the most brazen move yet. I returned from a supply run to find a bulldozer and excavator parked at the edge of my property. A crew in construction vests was consulting plans and marking boundaries with stakes and orange flags. I approached the foreman, who explained they'd been contracted by Meadow Creek Estates to begin preliminary work for drainage improvements. "This is private property," I informed him. "You don't have permission to be here." The foreman looked confused and showed me his work order, which included a permit number and an easement claim for a 20-foot strip along my eastern boundary, precisely where my historic barn stood. I immediately called Laura, who advised me to document everything and ask them to leave pending verification of the easement claim. The foreman reluctantly agreed after I showed him my deed and property survey, which made no mention of such an easement. At the county offices, we discovered that an easement application had indeed been filed 3 days earlier claiming historical access rights for drainage. The application was still under review and had not been approved, yet Patricia had moved forward as if it were a done deal. "This is getting ridiculous," Laura muttered as we left the county building. "She's not even trying to follow proper procedures anymore." The next day brought the court hearing for our motion to suspend the HOA's authority. The courtroom was surprisingly crowded. Many local residents had come to watch, along with the reporter who'd contacted me and representatives from the Historical Society. Patricia arrived with Martin Fletcher, the yoga-attired board member, whose name I now knew was Diane Hartwell, and a stern-looking attorney in an expensive suit. They huddled together, occasionally glancing in my direction with undisguised hostility. Judge Eleanor Wilson, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, called the hearing to order. Our argument was straightforward. The HOA had improperly incorporated my property without following legally required notification and objection procedures, as evidenced by Thomas Mercer's documented opposition that had been inexplicably omitted from the final records. The HOA's attorney argued that the statute of limitations had expired for challenging the incorporation, and that by purchasing the property, I had implicitly accepted the existing covenant restrictions. Then Laura played her trump card testimony from the former county clerk, who had processed the rezoning application 15 years earlier. She had recently retired and had come forward after reading about the dispute in the Historical Society newsletter. "I remember this case clearly," Margaret Daniels testified. "It was unusual because Mr. Mercer was quite elderly but very determined. He filed a formal objection and received acknowledgement. I personally added it to the file. When I saw the final approval without his objection noted, I questioned it, but was told by my supervisor to let it go." "And who was your supervisor at that time, Mrs. Daniels?" Laura asked. Margaret hesitated, then pointed across the courtroom. "Gerald Greenwood, Patricia Greenwood's husband." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge Wilson called for order, her expression grave as she considered this new information. "Your Honor," Laura continued, "we have reason to believe that the improper incorporation of the Mercer property was not merely an administrative oversight, but part of a deliberate attempt to force the sale of historically significant land for commercial development purposes." The judge listened carefully as Laura outlined the pattern of harassment, the falsified government notices, and the recent unauthorized attempt to establish an easement on my property. These actions demonstrate a consistent pattern of bad faith and potentially illegal conduct aimed at forcing Mr. Weston to either sell his property or surrender his right to restore a historically significant structure. By the time Laura finished, Patricia's face had lost its usual confident expression. Her attorney requested a recess to confer with his clients, which the judge granted. When court resumed, the HOA's attorney had a completely different tone. "Your Honor, in the interest of resolving this matter efficiently, my clients are prepared to acknowledge that there may have been procedural irregularities in the incorporation process for Mr. Weston's property. We are willing to exempt this specific parcel from HOA jurisdiction moving forward." Judge Wilson narrowed her eyes. "This sudden reversal suggests you recognize the strength of the plaintiff's case. Before I rule on this matter, I want all documentation related to the original incorporation process submitted for review, including any communications between the HOA board and county officials during that time." Patricia whispered urgently to her attorney, who looked increasingly uncomfortable. "Additionally," the judge continued, "I'm referring the allegations of falsified government notices to the district attorney's office for investigation. This court takes very seriously any attempt to impersonate government officials or create fraudulent documents." The hearing concluded with a temporary injunction preventing the HOA from issuing further fines or taking any action against my property until a full review of the incorporation process could be completed. As we left the courtroom, Catherine Mercer approached with an older man I hadn't met before. "This is my Uncle Robert, another of Thomas Mercer's grandchildren. He has something important to tell you." Robert Mercer was in his 70s, with the same determined set to his jaw that I'd seen in photos of his grandfather. When Grandpa Thomas was fighting the HOA, he didn't just file objections. He amended his will with a covenant of his own, one that requires any future owner to maintain the historical character of the property. If the property is substantially altered or demolished, ownership reverts to his descendants. This revelation stunned me. So even if I had wanted to tear down the farmhouse, "You couldn't have," Robert confirmed, "not without triggering the reversion clause." Patricia knows this. Her husband handled some legal work for our family years ago, before the HOA existed. That's why she's been so desperate to find ways around it. The only way they could extend the golf course was to force a sale to the HOA itself, then claim some emergency exemption from the covenant. This explained so much about Patricia's relentless campaign against me. She hadn't just been a rule-obsessed HOA president. She had been executing a long-term strategy to circumvent legal protections on a property she coveted. The following weeks brought a cascade of revelations and consequences. The district attorney's office opened an investigation into the falsified notices, leading to criminal charges against Martin Fletcher, who eventually implicated Patricia in the scheme. The county launched a review of all easement applications submitted by the HOA, finding several instances of questionable claims. Most significantly, a former board member came forward with emails and meeting minutes showing that Patricia and her husband had deliberately manipulated the incorporation process 15 years earlier to include properties they wanted for future development, while concealing objections from affected owners. 3 months after our courtroom confrontation, Patricia resigned from the HOA board as criminal charges for fraud, forgery, and abuse of position were filed against her. Gerald Greenwood, who had left his county position years earlier, also faced charges related to official misconduct. The new interim HOA board, led by residents tired of Patricia's regime, officially recognized the exclusion of my property from their jurisdiction and issued a public apology for the harassment I'd endured. With legal obstacles cleared, I focused fully on the farmhouse restoration. The Virginia Department of Historic Resources approved my application, officially designating the property as historically significant and eligible for preservation grants and tax incentives. Eliza and other Mercer family members shared more photos, stories, and even original furnishings that had been distributed among relatives when the house was partially modernized in the 1960s. Local craftspeople offered their services, excited to be part of restoring a piece of community heritage. The project became something of a community effort. Harold Jenkins brought his grandson, a carpenter specializing in historical techniques, to help with the porch restoration. The Historical Society organized volunteer weekends for landscaping work, clearing decades of overgrowth to reveal the original garden layout. 6 months into the restoration, with the exterior largely complete and interior work progressing steadily, I hosted an open house for neighbors and supporters. The farmhouse was beginning to shine again, the original clapboard siding restored to its warm white finish, the wraparound porch rebuilt with hand-turned posts matching the historical photos, windows with wavy antique glass reinstalled in frames crafted to match the originals. Among the visitors was Officer Reynolds, who had helped build the case against Patricia and Martin. "Hard to believe this is the same place," she remarked, admiring the transformation. "Patricia's court date is set for next month, by the way. The DA is confident about the case." "What happens to the HOA now?" I asked. "From what I've heard, they're completely restructuring. The interim board is rewriting the covenant to be less restrictive and more focused on maintaining property values without micromanaging design choices." She smiled. "Sometimes it takes a good shake-up to remind people what these associations should actually be about: community, not control." As the afternoon sun cast a golden glow across the newly restored farmhouse, I stood on the porch with Eliza Mercer, who had tears in her eyes as she looked at her family home reborn. "Thomas would be so proud," she said softly, "not just of how beautiful it is, but of how you fought for it. This place was always meant to stand as a reminder of what came before, even as everything around it changes." I thought about the journey of the past year, from excited new homeowner to unwitting HOA rebel to historic preservationist. What had begun as a simple desire to restore a beautiful old farmhouse had evolved into something more meaningful. A defense of history against erasure, of individual rights against overreach, and of community values against commercialization. As the last visitors departed, I sat alone on the porch steps, listening to the creaking of the old house settling around me. The sound no longer seemed like decay, but like conversation, the building telling its stories, sharing its memories, breathing with new life. Patricia had called it an eyesore, but looking at it now, with its weathered dignity and authentic character standing proudly amidst the cookie-cutter development surrounding it, I knew the truth. This wasn't an eyesore, it was a vision. A vision of the past honored, not erased, of craftsmanship celebrated, not abandoned, of a community's roots remembered, not forgotten. 1 year after my purchase of the property, the restoration was featured in Virginia Living magazine, alongside coverage of Patricia and Gerald Greenwood's conviction for fraud and misconduct. The contrast could not have been more poetic, the farmhouse rising as those who had tried to destroy it fell. The legal battles had depleted much of my savings, but the historical designation had brought grants and tax benefits that helped offset the costs. More importantly, it had brought protection. The property was now listed on the National Register of Historic Places, ensuring that no future HOA could threaten its existence. As for the Meadow Creek Estates, HOA, it underwent a complete transformation under new leadership. The draconian rules were relaxed. The focus shifted to community building rather than restriction enforcement, and a new emphasis was placed on respecting the area's rural heritage rather than trying to erase it. The following spring, as apple blossoms drifted across the newly restored orchard behind the farmhouse, I hosted a different kind of gathering, the inaugural meeting of the county's Historical Preservation Council, formed in response to the attention my case had brought to the importance of protecting local landmarks. Among the attendees was Judge Wilson, who had overseen our initial hearing. "You know," she said as we walked the grounds, "cases like yours are why I became a judge. Sometimes the law needs a human touch to ensure justice is truly served." I thought about all the ways the system had nearly failed: the realtor's deception, the HOA's manipulation, the county's initial reluctance to get involved. Yet somehow, with persistence and help from unexpected allies, the right outcome had prevailed. The farmhouse stood as testament to that victory, not just my personal victory, but a victory for everyone who believed that history deserved protection, that rules should serve people rather than trap them, and that sometimes fighting for what's right is worth every struggle. As twilight settled over the land that had been cultivated by generations of the Mercer family, now continuing its life under my stewardship, I felt a profound sense of responsibility and connection. The house had chosen me as much as I had chosen it, and together we had weathered a storm that might have destroyed us both. Patricia had called it an eyesore, but in the end, her vision had failed while the farmhouse endured, just as it had for 100 years, and just as it would, I hoped, for 100 more.